Take 12. Is your life kinda complicated? Welcome to One Take, the podcast designed to seek wisdom to live simple, healthy, and happy. We'll get there one take at a time. I'm your host, Jasmine Thomas. And welcome to Take 12 of One Take, the podcast. I am your host, Jasmine Thomas, and as usual, I am super happy to have you here. Today on the show, I have an extremely special guest for me, and kind of a confession to make to you guys. It's sort of an indulgent episode this time. You know how I've been trying to share with you things, information, interviews that will inspire you to be the best person that you are here to be. And today, my guest is someone that I really look up to. It's someone that I admire. It's a fellow journalist. And sometimes when you are wondering if you're doing what you were supposed to do and you're like feeling a little lost, lacking motivation, my recommendation for you guys is to look up and, if possible, talk to those people that you admire. Now, let's define that, because I know some people that, I admire Beyonce, I admire such and such president. Okay, let's get real. They are not accessible to you. But look at your immediate circle and who are those people that you admire? I have to tell you, I admire my dad and my mom, and I also admire fellow journalists that are doing excellent work, that are pursuing excellence every single day on every story they write. And that person for me is Alfredo Corchado. He has been for many years covering what's going on in Mexico. He has collaborated with the Dallas Morning News as a correspondent in Mexico City. And I gotta tell you, he embraces the dream job that I will never have and that I don't have the guts to pursue. Because what he does, to me, is very dangerous. And as a journalist, I feel like being a journalist, it's a privilege to tell people's stories. But sometimes it's hard because those stories could put you in danger. And as I enter a phase in my life where I start wondering if I'm doing what I was supposed to be doing, with my career, with the path that God has for me, when I get doubts, I look at those people that can offer wisdom to me and guidance. And I look at how they pursue their jobs with excellence and admire them. And that's why I wanted to have Alfredo on the show today, because he is really somebody that embraces excellence in journalism. His work is amazing. And if you don't know his work, I welcome you to Google him. He has also published a book called Midnight in Mexico, which I have a copy of, and he signed it for me. So I feel like super important because I have a signed copy of his book. So, but what we're going to do is just going to have a conversation with him. How did he start it? How did he get into it? And just, enjoy it. I really enjoyed it. It was an indulgence for me to have him on the show today. And I just wanted to share with you a conversation that inspires me. And I invite you, if you are lacking motivation for your career, for whatever you're doing, look around and identify people that you admire, people that you want to be where they are, people that you want to do what they're doing. Reach out to them and talk to them. And you are going to, at the end of that encounter, if you decide to do it, you're really going to feel different. You're going to feel empowered. You're going to feel inspired. And that's how I feel today. So without further ado, this is my featured conversation with journalist and published author Alfredo Corchado. Okay, everyone, today it's a little bit of an indulgence for me because my guest, it's someone that I really look up to. It's one of the best journalists that I know, and I've had the pleasure of meeting him in person a couple times. And I really admire his work. What he's doing comes real close to my heart. And he's the person that I wish I was doing what he's doing, but I do not have the guts that it takes to do his job. Welcome to the show, Alfredo Corchado. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you for having me, Yasmin. And I think it's a mutual admiration club here.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It means the world to me. So, Alfredo, tell us, I know a little bit about yourself because you are a fellow journalist, but tell everyone, how do you get started? Tell us about your background growing up, and how do you figure out that you wanted to be a journalist?
Well, I was born in a small little town in Durango, in a place called San Luis de Cordero, Durango. I'm the son of a bracero worker who back in the 1950s, early 60s, was one of the special authorized guest workers in the United States, working in Texas, then later in Arizona, California. Eventually was able to get his green card. Because even then, I think Mexican workers were able to prove that they were indispensable in order for Americans to have, their vegetables and everything. Long story short, he was able to legalize my two brothers and my mother, and we ended up moving to first to Ciudad Juarez, and then later on to the Central Valley of California. Grew up with my brothers. There were four of us. Later, there was another brother that came, but we all worked as farm workers in California. I mean, not all, because some of them were very small, but my brother and I, small kids, growing up in the fields. And I think what got me interested in journalism was watching, my parents in the fields. They were members of the Cesar Chavez Union. So there was a lot of buzz on television and the media. And one day this TV crew shows up and they're interviewing people about the fields and what it's like to work in the fields. And I think they spotted me. I always say that reporters are as much as we get a lot of criticism, some of them can be pretty smart and observant. And I think they looked at me and said, this is just a kid. He's not, maybe he should be out in the field. So they started asking me all these questions about what it was like to work in the fields. My mother was horrified. She thought, oh my God, he probably said the wrong things and now we're going to be deported back to Mexico. But it left me with a sense of curiosity. I was intrigued that somebody wanted to tell my story. Somebody was interested enough. Somebody was curious enough to ask me, what was it like to work in the fields without a break, without clean drinking water, and what were the conditions like, etc. This is the Fresno area, the San Joaquin Valley. I think that's really what started me thinking, if my mother says that she sacrificed everything she knew to give us a better life, was this what she meant? That you can actually dream of being anything you want, of growing up to become anything. And I think at the time I thought this would actually be something interesting to do. Not knowing that I would do it, but I think you daydream, and I also used to daydream I could be Juan Gabriel or be a songwriter, but reporting was something that was something I guess as a Mexican kid, I miss Mexico so much that I thought I want to go back to Mexico. I want to go and look at what I left behind. Be able to re-embrace my roots, my culture, my language. I think for me, journalism was the best vehicle. It was the best tool.
And let me ask you about working on the fields. What was that like?
It wasn't until many years later that when I started reading about the horrible conditions and how people did not, people would be sprayed. There were planes that were over you, And I later found out that it could have been DDT, it could have been pesticides, it could have been something else. I mean, there was so much that I later learned as a journalist about the fields. But for me, at the moment, at the time, even today, when I think back, and this may sound like a big contradiction, but I can't think of a better time for us as a family because we were so united, we were so close. The people we work with, I mean, um, obviously the majority of them were Mexicans, but there was such a sense of camaraderie between all of us. I mean, I think being a kid growing up in a new country in a strange environment, having that bond, having that connection, made us feel very close to one another. So I think of the fields now with mixed emotions. And yes, I wish we had more clean drinking waters. I wish we had more even basic things like toilets, or we had 15, 20 minutes to, eat your burrito in the morning and have a later lunch break. I look back now and I think, wow, we were able to do that. We were able to survive that. And so there's that part of you that's kind of critical, but there's that part of you that appreciates, and I guess part of me kind of looks at it in a nostalgic way and thinks of how close we were as a family and how close I was with my brothers, having all my brothers there and my mother. It was a special time. It was a bonding experience, I think, for all of us. But it wasn't until later as a reporter. At the time, I was working for the El Paso Herald Post, my first job in El Paso, Texas, and I was able to interview Cesar Chavez. And I think before the interview, I started doing some research about Cesar Chavez and the union and the UFW, and I was fascinated. And then I realized, oh my God, I was part of that. I mean, I lived through that with my mother and with my father. The other thing that's fascinating is to see the transformation of my own parents. I mean, my father, I really didn't really know my father as a kid because he would only come once a year, spend maybe a month, 2 months in Durango. To me, he was a stranger. But my mother, we were close. I mean, today we're still very close. But I saw how my mother transformed from this person who was, meek, kind of quiet, would sing for us in Durango, would sort of be the actress in the family, doing the theater show. But then I saw this other woman sort of come of age in the fields. I mean, a woman who would lead many times the protests, the marches against the ranchers and against the people who own the crops. And I think that was fascinating to watch as a kid, to watch how one country was able to transform one of my parents into something that I didn't know.
Thank you for sharing that. And to go back a little bit, in Mexico, you tell me they left for a better life. What was it like in the little town in Durango where you guys lived?
That's a great question because, lately I've asked myself that a lot, and I talked to my parents because as growing up as kids, my mother would always say, we sacrificed everything we knew for you guys so that you can become something better. And I think as a child or as a teenager, I felt like I had failed them because I dropped out of high school. And so I became a high school dropout, and that was like the worst nightmare for your parents, especially when you're the oldest. I mean, I think that really set them back and made them very, very worried that maybe their sacrifice would not be worth it, would not be fully fulfilled. So I went to Durango last fall and spent some time with my mother and my father. And we walked the streets, and you realize when you're in a place like San Luis de Cordero, like many, many communities throughout Mexico, I mean, hundreds, if not thousands of communities, how you don't really see the poverty that you hear about because we are so dependent on the United States. We're so dependent on the remittances, the remesas. And my mother would, tell me the story about how when we were kids, we were always wearing new clothes, or my grandmother was always making something for us. There was always enough food. We had Comes Palacio, which was not far. We had Torreon, and we were able to go to for shopping. And she said, we had a story that there was always plenty of things to do because of your father, because of the money that he sent back. But even then, we lived in a system that didn't really reward hard work. That you had to be part of this elite system in Mexico in order to get ahead. And I think that's what my parents' lesson, and I think the lesson of millions of Mexicans, is that even though you had the 1910 Mexican Revolution to try to build a more equal country, in the end, it didn't do that, and so it kept pushing people out of the country. And I think certainly the story that we lived through was that. I mean, it. I think in any ways we're like a portrait of the failed promises of the revolution.
And you're right. If there's something that I admire about living in the United States, it's that merit system where you can actually really work hard and find your way through, and you're not just going to get the job because of the last name that you have or who's recommending you or the connections that your family or your parents have. It's that actually here in the United States, it really doesn't matter who you are as long as you work your tail off, you can get there.
I think we always felt, that we were like the guinea pigs in the family, and it's amazing now that you're older to see what your parents saw, or kind of look at things through their eyes. And America was really in their imagination. I mean, it was something that they imagined and something that they wanted from you. And it was always this belief: if you work hard enough, if you study hard enough, if you go to school, you do the right things, you can get ahead. And after I dropped out of high school, I mean, I wanted nothing more than to try to make amends with my parents and make, not make peace, but try to see if their theory worked, test their theory, test their vision and their dreams. And I think in the end, I hope they feel like it was fulfilled, because it's not just me, but a lot of the majority of my brothers and sisters, I mean, gone to school, they all have a profession, and it's really a tribute to my parents and their vision and their dreams. And I'm sure I speak for millions, not just Mexican Americans or immigrants from Latin America, but I think immigrants from all over the world who I think come to this country and they test their parents' dream, that there's something better for the next generation.
Yeah. And so I guess you decided to go back to high school and finish up, or how do you get yourself through college?
I guess it's a funny, tragic story. My mother said, you know, if you, I kept, because at that time, I felt that my biggest dream in my life was to have a car. I wanted to drive a car. And my mother, I think, finally found the sweet, I guess, the sweet spot, or the weak spot in me, and said, you know what? I will promise to give you any car you want, to sign, to help you with the down payment, even help you with the first 2-3 payments. But you got to promise me that you won't get married before you have an education, that you will get an education. I don't know how, but you need to go back and finish your, get a diploma, go to college. And number 3, promise me that you will leave California. Because I think for her at the time, Central California, the San Joaquin Valley, mostly if you were Mexican American, you weren't really thinking of UC Berkeley, you weren't thinking of UCLA, you were thinking of going back to the field. At least in my class, at least in my generation. I mean, I didn't see a lot of my fellow students, going back to or going to higher education. And so I ended up leaving California and moving to Texas. Ended up going to El Paso and went to El Paso Community College. Eventually got my degree there, associate's degree, and then was able to transfer to UTEP and, ended up becoming a journalist.
So, how do you make the decision? Because I remember when I went to college, I really didn't know what I wanted to do, and then I figured out what things really fire me up. Did that encounter when you were 13 years old with the TV crew? Did that stick with you, or did you find out later that you just had this hunger to learn and know and tell people stories?
It's kind of embarrassing to tell you because it's not. I guess maybe it's not the right answer, but yes, that encounter with the journalist did stay with me. It was curiosity. Um, but when I went to El Paso and I was at El Paso Community College, deep down, my parents had opened a small little restaurant, Brady's Cafe, and I thought, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to go to school. I'm going to get a business degree, and I'm going to run the restaurant. But when the counselor asked me, the community college counselor asked me, says, we need to come up with a plan for you. I mean, you're going to major in what, blah, blah, blah. What do you want to do? What can you see yourself doing? And I said, I'd like to be a hairdresser. He says, a hairdresser? And I was so influenced at the time by the movie Shampoo with Warren Beatty. And I said, yeah, I want to be a hairdresser. And he gave me the test, kind of an aptitude test. And I wrote that stuff down. And he says, you should think of something bigger. Maybe a diplomat, or maybe a foreign correspondent, because you have a curiosity for the world. You have a curiosity for languages. And I said, what is a foreign correspondent? And he said, that's a reporter. They live in a foreign country. And right there and then, I remember that moment. And I thought, this is what I want to do. I wanted to go back to Mexico. And I wanted to be a reporter. I wanted to be curious. And I thought, and I told the counselor, I said, there was a time when I was in the field and this guy interviewed me, blah, blah. Is that what I would do? He says, yeah, essentially. And at the time, you had these protests going on in Chihuahua. It was the PAN movement, the sort of the the ruling party had been there for decades. So there was all this excitement in Juarez. And a fellow student of mine, Jacobo Ramirez from Juarez, a photographer, camera guy, he would say, come with me. Let's just hang out. Let's spend some time. Let's see that. And there were so many students from community college who were Juarezenses. Next thing I know, I'm covering these protests, these marches, and I'm doing stories for the El Paso Community College newspaper, El Conquistador. And I think, I would say once I felt journalism in me, it became like a disease.
Yeah.
And there was no way to cure it. There's no way to cure it. You live it and you dream it. Yeah, I wanted to be Juan Gabriel. I did. I wrote some songs. Jacobo was a guitar player. We had another woman named Selena. She was a singer. We recorded some music in Juarez. We used to go through Avenida Juarez, Kentucky Club, and all that. El Noa Noa, that whole area. But when you're covering these protests and you're giving people a voice, and you're seeing what they're trying to do, and you're trying to convey that to readers, it becomes an addiction. And I think journalism has been an addiction, and to this day, I have not found a cure yet.
I have to agree with you, and especially when you're covering protests, the energy, the sentiment, the emotion of the people, it gets under your skin, and it makes you want to stay there and tell their story and just be a witness of it. It, to me, creates this kind of energy or emotion that I've not felt it any other way. But when I'm covering stories like that, or when you're having a really engaging interview with somebody that has a really unique story to tell, I have not felt that way when I'm doing my job by doing anything else. So I totally can relate to that.
No, it was such an addiction, and then it was Ciudad Juarez. We had protests going on in Tijuana, and then suddenly it starts spreading around the country. Guanajuato, San Luis Potosí, the whole Bajío region, eventually Mexico City, and I just got a taste of it at the in El Paso Juarez. Um, so when I had my first real job moving to Philadelphia, I was working for the Wall Street Journal. I missed it so much. I mean, I would look at the calendar and time my vacations, time my days off, uh, tied to events in Mexico. If I knew there was a protest or there was something going on, I would take that week and go back and try to be around to cover that or get a taste of it. It was still a very very exciting moment in Mexico. When you look back at that time period.
Definitely. So you start working, you graduate, you start working at different newspapers. How do you end up in Dallas or working for the Dallas Morning News?
I ended up I was working for the Wall Street Journal, and then I ended up going back to my first job was in Philadelphia at the Journal, and then I ended up moving to Dallas for the Journal bureau because I wanted to be closer to Mexico. I want to be on the border, and that was the closest I could get to. Um, I ended up the El Paso Herald Post, which at the time was owned by Scripps Howard. It was an afternoon newspaper. Went back to them and covered northern Mexico, Chihuahua, the border. I think I did that for about 2 years. The Dallas Morning News was always the paper where I thought, this paper seems to be serious about Mexico. Yeah, they had two correspondents. They had a bureau in El Paso. I mean, they seemed to really get it, the binational ties and how stories from that area was really a local story for North Texas.
Yeah.
So I got my break at the Morning News in 1993. I was working in Arlington, Texas, covering the ballpark at the time. I think George W. Bush was one of the owners. And that was my break. I ended up a year in Dallas, commuting between the M streets and Arlington, Texas. A year later, I moved to Mexico City as a correspondent for the Dallas Morning News. The moment when the peso was, devaluing. This is Ernesto Cedillo had just become president, and it was a tumultuous time. I mean, you had the Zapatistas.
Yeah.
Colosio had been killed, and then you had peso weakening, and you thought, okay, I don't know if when I wake up in the morning whether we will still have Mexico, but we did, obviously. And, those were very defining times for Mexico. I mean, you had NAFTA, ORCA had passed in 86, 87. You had all these, Mexicans who left. You had a booming economy in the United States. Immigration, legal and illegal, was high. There was so much going on, the whole dynamics of immigration, the economy, and obviously the political opening.
Yeah.
And as you said earlier, which I think is incredibly true and incredibly eloquent, is you have a seat to witness. I mean, you're sitting there, you're not watching a Mavericks game or a Cowboy game or a Rangers game. You're watching history unfold, and you're working as a correspondent for the Dallas Morning News. I mean, I will wake up and say, God, my mother was so right. This is really a country of opportunities. I can't believe I'm doing this.
I remember that time when I was living in Guadalajara, and I remember my parents talking about it and how the devaluation of the peso affected them and my dad's business, and everyone around, was talking about it. The banks were closed. I remember that. Yeah.
Very sad times for I think for a lot of Mexicans. But I also learned something about Mexicans, and that was I remember it was 1995, and I kept telling my editors we got to do a story about how Easter vacation is coming and no one's leaving because they have no money. And man, that was such a bad idea, such a bad story, because my editor said, okay, yeah, that's a great story, let's do that. And then I'm in Mexico City, in Semana Santa. Everybody left. They didn't care. I mean, for them, it was about family. And for them, it was, I think that's when I learned a big, big fundamental difference between Americans and Mexicans is they really do, work to live. and it's
Exactly.
not live to work. And I thought, this is a fascinating story. So we did end up doing a story, but really the other way around.
And that's exactly, I see that too. In Mexico, I go, I see my family, they're working, and then they go home and they eat, and they swing by my, cousins or aunt's house on the way back to work. And here, I wish I could even have anyone near me, to swing by on my way from work or to work. It's a totally different dynamic. And I think that what helps too is that families and friendships, they're closer, they live closer, so you can actually do that. And in here, everything is so huge, everyone moves for work. It's really hard to keep up with your relationships and your family, when for me it's been when you live in the United States.
Right, exactly. I mean, it's these two worlds, that you merge, and sometimes you feel like there's not much of a difference between both countries. Well, maybe these days you do because of the times we live in. But but I think there is that fundamental difference that really hasn't changed that much. I remember when people were after NAFTA, people were trying to, the obsession in Mexico was we got to cut lunches from 3 hour, 4 hour lunches to an hour like the Americans. And I think I think for a while it was working, but you go back to Mexico City these days, and some of these habits I think are hard to die.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, definitely. So then you start covering Mexico. How do you start covering the stories about the drug cartels? Because I mean, that's really a staple of yours, covering the drug wars and the drug cartels. That's something that anybody that knows your work knows that you pretty much specialize on the topic. How do you end up covering those stories?
I cringe. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, when I went to Mexico, my goal was to tell stories about migration and stories about family separations because that's what I learned to live with as a kid. That's what I saw. That's what I witnessed. I wanted to tell stories about, policy from Mexico City to the U.S., although it's really more Washington to Mexico. I ended up working in D.C., in the bureau in D.C. to try to specialize more on the relationship between both countries. And the story about drug traffickers, I think, was a story that I did not want to cover. I mean, I promised my parents when I left from Mexico that I would never cover that story because it was not interesting, and because I also thought this is kind of an insane story. So you have demand in the United States, and you have Mexicans willing to risk their lives, and maybe not in those days. I mean, you didn't see the killing that we see today, but you saw people sneaking in stuff all the time. We had a restaurant in El Paso, 3, 4 blocks from the border, and so you saw this, firsthand. You saw the dangers, and you also saw just the insanity of it. When I told my mom and my father, I got a job in Mexico, I'm leaving, they said, promise me you'll never cover that story. I said, I'm not interested. But I think it was after 9/11, when I went back to Mexico from DC, that I started seeing things from a different way. I mean, my first job, my first assignment when I returned to Mexico was to cover Ciudad Juarez and try to answer the question, why are so many women dying? Who's behind the killing of the women in Juarez? It was a horrible, and it continues in many parts of Mexico, including Ciudad Juarez, where you see many, many women killed. But when I started looking at the numbers, there's two things that struck me. One was the impunity rate, where it was like in the majority of the cases, whether you're a woman or a man, there's no justice. I mean, there's no, the judicial institutions were so weak. And then you saw the number of people killed, and it was thousands of people altogether. I mean, and suddenly I told my editor, I said, I think we're missing the story. I mean, it's not just women, but it's people everywhere. I mean, they're dying, and and there's really no justice. There's no judicial institutions. There's no real due process, etc. I knew all that in the 90s covering Mexico, but we had someone else who was more the specialist covering that. And journalism changed dramatically. I mean, we're still going through a lot of changes, The Dallas Morning News at one point, I think, had the biggest bureau of any American newspaper. I mean, we had a staff of about 12 people. Ended up, little by little, start losing people. That by early 2001, 2002, 2003, you could not say we have a reporter who specializes in drug trafficking. I mean, you had to cover everything. And that's when I started covering Juarez. And then I started covering Nuevo Laredo and the Zetas. And you saw these armed men with, AR-15s, rocket grenades, rocket launchers. And you see all this mayhem. And you start thinking, this is a story that you cannot overlook. Mexico was going through a big, dramatic political change where you have a political vacuum created by the first opposition government. So you could not really ignore that story anymore. You could not get away from it. But I think because of, in a way, my naiveness of the issue made me cover the story the same way I would cover any story. Just asking questions, probing and probing. And suddenly you start to see that there was a pushback, that it made some people very uncomfortable. And this is a time when, some of your colleagues in Mexico ended up dead, and there was nothing to be done about it. So there was a lot of, I guess, inner debate. Is this story worth it? I mean, should I continue to cover the story when other people are being silenced or other people are dying? It's a debate that I still have to this day. But I think in the end, you have to remind yourself that, yes, you are Mexican. Yes, you were born in Durango. But I'm also an American journalist, and I have a lot more protection than my colleagues in Mexico have. And I felt that was my only justification. I mean, there are a lot of people in my own family, my own friends, my own colleagues who may disagree with me. But I think once I started covering that story, I just felt that it was a story that that Americans did not really know that much about, or did not understand the full scope of it and what was at stake. And the stake was really a country's national security for me. I mean, young governments who didn't really know how to deal with some of what was happening, with the amount of corruption that you saw, the number of people being killed, the number of regions that were being silenced. Not that Mexico is only violence, or that's not the only story. I think when you cover Mexico, you have to nuance things. You have to also see, well, there's another part of Mexico that's also doing pretty well. But you can't get to the other part of Mexico until I think you deal with this issue. And even today, I mean, Mexico has not really been able to deal with the issue. I mean, there's still many regions that are still in silence. But I think the worst thing is when you just kind of normalize things and you look the other way, and you live as many of my colleagues, live, and they're being forced into silence. I think as a journalist, especially one with protection, you have to keep telling the story over and over again.
And I will forever admire you, because I would love to do what you do, but I don't have the courage to do what you do, because I fear that, my life would be on the line. And I'm going to ask you this question. I know the answer to it because I'm holding your book here, and because, you talk about this in your book, Midnight in Mexico. But do you fear for your life as you're reporting on the Mexican drug cartels?
I mean, I would lie if I said I didn't fear for my life. I mean, yes, I fear for my life, but I also fear for the lives of many other people who are much more vulnerable, whether it's, your own colleagues. And you have to respect their courage too, and you have to kind of understand where they're coming from. I mean, I had colleagues who would meet me on the U.S. side to tell me stories that they couldn't print, and they would look up to you. I think I was able to sort of rationalize a lot of things in me, and felt that the more you report, the more you told these stories, and the more people saw that you had a sense of someone watching over you. I mean, I remember, the big death threat that I received in 2007. Um, to me, was remarkable that you had the U.S. Embassy come out with a statement, backing you up. That I had my own editor at the Dallas Morning News, and they came up with an editorial, and they were calling other newspapers in Texas and I think other parts of the country, saying if something happens to my reporter or your reporter or this reporter, we're all going to stand up in unity. And that, I think, was able to kind of give me a sense of mission and a sense of I'm not by myself. I mean, I'm not one of my colleagues in Mexico who oftentimes has, they have no one to turn to. Their own government, their own industry, their own colleagues oftentimes just, turn their backs to them. I mean, yes, I fear for my life, maybe not as much as I did back then, because now I'm most of the time I'm spending, in the United States. But when I'm in Mexico, do I think about it? Yeah, I think about it. But I got to tell you, something that hasn't changed with me is I continue to love Mexico, and I continue to believe in Mexico, and I believe in what we can become as a Mexican people or as a country. And that's something that I want to be able to tell that story and be part of that story as long as I can.
Yeah, I love Mexico. Every time I go, to me, it's like it's so hard to not be there. And I really hope that the situation in Mexico improves, because the Mexican people deserve it. And I would love to be able to feel totally comfortable visiting there. So as we prepare to wrap up, what have been some of the most difficult things that you've had to experience in your career, and also the most rewarding?
The most difficult things, I mean, obviously has to be with the drug war. And I think one of the hardest stories that I reported on uh, was the massacre in Ciudad Juarez. And a story where you think you know the answers, where you hear, more teenagers were killed, and you think, oh, okay, they were probably drugged by a shooting, or they were part of a gang. And then you realize, no, they were, from everything we report on there were good kids who were just celebrating a birthday party and a win, uh, a baseball game, and they were celebrating. And the bad guys got the wrong house and ended up killing more than a dozen. Um, that to me was the hardest story, because I realized as a reporter, me personally, how wrong I had been in my own assumptions. And I think for Mexico, it was like a turning point where people started questioning, okay, what are we doing? What is this drug war? I mean, there was such sadness that day. Raining and raining in Ciudad Juarez. It was January, I think, 31st, 2010, and the rains and the rains, and you're thinking, if it wasn't raining, I think you look around at all your colleagues, all the reporters, and I think it was hard for people not to be crying. I mean, not to be teary-eyed. That was difficult, and meeting with their parents, talking to the relatives, the brothers and sisters of these kids, and realizing, they could be your own family. I mean, I have family in Juarez and other parts of Mexico. That was difficult. And I think it was also difficult to believe in Mexico at that point, because things were so grim. But yet, it was also, I think, one of the most rewarding things, because you saw how families fought back. I often tell people, I think the greatest hope in Mexico is in the mothers and the fathers who fight back, who learn to take their country back. And it's not that, it's this dramatic Hollywood story where, yes, we've learned to conquer our fears, and now we're taking back our country. It's happening, maybe not as dramatically as you want it to be, but you see it slowly, gradually. Maybe you take a step forward, and sometimes you take two steps back, but you see something that people are striving for. It may not be the country that we think it can be, in our lifetime, but I think it's moving. And I think that sense of will, that sense of mission, uh, has stayed with me. That yes, you continue to kind of push for it, and continue to write about it, and that's really the only way you can change people's perception about a country. Is you keep writing the story, you keep telling about their hopes and tragedies, but you continue to put that story in the map. Um, I think the story that I always walk away with is there's a sense of accomplishment was the night that Vicente Fox won in 2000. And I mean, he Vicente Fox, gave me the first interview. I mean, he was the president-elect of Mexico, and he could
Wow.
have gone to the New York Times, he could have gone to Televisa, but with the help of a local person from the Dallas Fort Worth area, Juan Hernandez, uh, Vicente Fox kept to his word and gave me the first interview. And I remember, leaving the PAN headquarters that evening and getting in the car to go back to my place in Coyoacán and write the story. And, I should have called my editor. I should say, hey, we got the first interview with Fox. And instead, I called my mother. And I said, Mamá, acabo de hablar con Vicente Fox. I just finished talking to Vicente Fox. And this is what he said. And I thought the phone went dead because I couldn't hear anything. And all I could hear was my dad picked up the phone and said, your mother's crying.
Oh.
Uh, I mean, that to me was the most powerful moment. It's because I guess in some ways, their dream had come true. A boy who leaves Mexico and comes back and is a correspondent, and he interviews the first opposition president. Um, my mom says, that's something I don't think you could have done if we had stayed in Mexico.
Definitely. I'm extremely proud. Wow. I'm thinking of your mom. I'm imagining her, and yeah, I can see the moment. Now you are working on your second book, Midnight in Mexico. First book. Now, second book. Is it a sequel? What can you tell us about it, or is it everything secret?
Well, no, it's not a secret. It's still a work in progress, and I hope to finish it in the hopefully the next few months. And the story is really about the Mexico within the United States, and it's a story told through four friends, nonfiction, first person, four friends who meet up in Philadelphia. Back then when I was working at the Wall Street Journal, and you trace the last 3 decades with the help of your friends. One goes into the restaurant spirits world, which I guess is called soft power. Another friend gets involved in politics and runs for mayor of Philadelphia. Another one works on human rights and the rights of immigrants from both sides of the border. And then you have me, the journalist, again witnessing history over the last 3 decades, and you're I guess in some ways you're measuring their progress or lack of progress through their lives, through their eyes, which is really a reflection, I think, of the more than 35 million Mexican Americans or Americans in this country who trace their roots one way or another back to Mexico, and that's essentially what the book is about. Heavy on migration, and obviously our new president has made the issue resonate even more, or made it even more relevant as we talk today.
Definitely. Well, I am looking forward to it. So keep us posted on any times for us to be able to pre-order on Amazon or any of that.
I will be happy to. You believe me.
Awesome.
I will call you and I will let you know, and I'm sure we'll be touring and telling as many people as possible to read a story about the latest, chapter in America's immigration saga.
Excellent. Well, Alfredo, I have nothing else but to thank you. I mean, we could talk forever and for hours, but you have commitments and I want to respect our time. And I want to thank you so much. It is always my honor to share any time that I can with you, to be able to pick your mind and to listen to your stories. I admire you, and you are very courageous, and a person committed to excellence in journalism, and I am really grateful to know you and to be able to have you on the show. Thank you so much.
Yasmin, anytime. I appreciate it. I appreciate all your generosity, and I will be looking forward to our next conversation.
When you get the book, we'll get you back on.
Thank you.
Thank you, Alfredo.
Thank you.
I hope you guys enjoyed this conversation as much as I did. And if you did, please share it. Share it on Facebook, Twitter, anywhere you can. Help me get the word out. Also, if you want to get in touch with Alfredo, he's on Twitter. His handle is at AJ Corchado. That would be spelled as AJCORCHADO. So go ahead and send him a message, a tweet, follow him, stay in touch with him. As always, guys, I remind you, if you have a minute, please leave me a written review and a rating on iTunes if you're listening on iTunes. And that process can be complicated sometimes. So if you don't know how to do it, Google it or send me a message or something. I'll be happy to walk you through. But if you use iTunes and you've left reviews for other people before, then you know what I'm talking about. If you can have just spend a couple minutes, maybe just 1 minute of your day, leaving me a written review and a rating on iTunes, I would very much appreciate it. And also help me get the word out. I'm going to be posting this on social media, Facebook, Twitter, everywhere. So if you can, if you're enjoying this and you can share it for me to help me get the word out about what I'm doing with this podcast and get some people inspired. If you know journalists that are questioning what they're doing, lacking inspiration, share this with them. Or really anybody who's lacking inspiration or motivation in their careers. This is something that I hope they find useful and inspiring. And if you can help me get the word out about this episode and all the other episodes, I would just be very grateful. That's all I have for you guys today. Remember, visit my blog at yesminthomas.com, YEZMINTHOMAS. You're going to find there the links to contact my guests and any resources that we talk about. You're going to have the links over there. So till the next one, remember, take it easy. I'm going to talk to you guys on the next take.